Welcome to Labour Grassroots. Here we are with our PR debate. I know everyone all over the country has been discussing this in their CLP, so I thought I'd capitalise on that and have a show on it, and we can all hear what everyone else has been saying in their CLPs. We've got people from different sides of this argument, and it's going to be very quick changes between people. I'm trying to keep everyone to 3 minutes, but I've given Howard and Clive Lewis 5 minutes because they're special guests, so they get an extra 2. Here, to start the discussion, I thought we'd start with Howard because Howard is a supporter of PR, and we can hear after Howard people who are opposed to PR or don't think it's the answer. So over to you, Howard. Why should we bring in PR, and why should Labour have a commitment to it in its manifesto?
Yes, well, thank you, Crispin, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the extra 2 minutes, because I fall into one of the sad categories of people who find PR immensely interesting and extremely important, and even I would go as far as to say sexy. Crispin, I should say at the start that I'm speaking in a personal capacity on this one, because Unite has a policy that is sadly, for me personally, first past the post. We obviously still believe in debate within Unite. We've got a policy conference that's coming up this year, and the electoral system is on the agenda, and I will be talking as passionately as I can within Unite about the importance of us taking a policy of proportional representation and trying to convince Labour to take a policy of proportional representation into the next election. Crispin, I will run through my arguments because I know that you've got a load of contributors tonight, and try and make it as succinct as possible. The first premise in respect of why we should be backing proportional representation is because we all believe in democracy. And the sad reality of the first past the post system is it is not democratic. And we know that. We know that for Labour to achieve a majority in Parliament, Labour would have to have a 7.4% lead in the polls over the Tories. Whereas for the Tories to get a majority in Parliament, their lead over Labour needs to be 3.4%. If the boundary changes come in, that becomes even worse. Labour would have to have an 8.2% lead in the polls to form a majority government, whereas the Tories would only need 3.9. And we know that at the present moment in time, if you're a member of the Green Party and you believe that the green environmental issues are the most important issues of the day, as many of us do, then 1.2 million votes buys you one member of Parliament. Whereas if you're in the DUP in Northern Ireland, 29,000 votes buys you a member of Parliament. So the system is undemocratic at the present moment in time. And for all of us, it is vitally important that we always speak for democracy within society. It is what underpins our very society. But we also should face the reality as to what first past the post has produced. First past the post has, over the last 50, 60 years, moved us to a situation where we now have the most right wing of governments imaginable. If this government, who preaches to us with go home vans and the scandal of Windrush, and fails to raise an eyebrow at racism within society, was in any other country, they would be called the BNP. They would be a nationalist party. What this electoral system has led us to is a movement of the centre, to a situation where people such as myself are described as hard left, and people who are in fact hard right wingers are described as centric. And that is the result of a first past the post system. And the reason why the first past the post system has produced that is because it is a system that allows voices not to be heard. It is a system that means entire communities can go without a voice. And why is that? That is because in certain parts of the country, Labour could frankly put up a cuddly toy with a red rosette and expected to have been elected. And that means that what we have produced now is exactly what we get within the PLP, because nobody has had to speak for Labour votes within the constituencies. Nobody's had to reach out and speak for them. Where has that led us as a society? Well, it's led to the SNP's success in Scotland. And we can debate on a call like this until we're blue in the face as to whether or not we believe that the SNP has got a socialist agenda or a nationalist agenda, or whether or not it deserves any left credentials whatsoever. It doesn't matter. The reality is that Labour lost those seats because Labour stopped listening to the people of those constituencies, and they stopped listening to the people of those constituencies because they thought that they no longer needed to. They thought that their voices were no longer heard. We then saw it again within the Brexit debate, where we could debate again, there's those amongst us who think that there's a very legitimate argument for a left Brexit, but we can debate all we like. What we know is that people decided for the very first time that their vote actually counted. One vote for one person. And they wanted to deliver a message to the establishment, an establishment that had failed to listen to them. So we have to remember right here now that with an electoral system where we think that we no longer need to listen to the voices of our communities, we ultimately will lose those communities. We will lose them as we did in Scotland. We will lose them as we have done in the Red Wall. We will lose them even in strongholds, and I'm sure Alan's on the call tonight, such as Walton. And the reason as to why is because there's thousands of votes in Walton where they just ultimately do not count because they are not needed in order to get an MP elected. And Crispin, I would have to say this as part of the argument as a trade unionist. You must start this debate as a trade unionist and ask, what has first past the post delivered for the trade union movement? And the reality is it has delivered nothing but a stranglehold on the right to strike and the voice of workers. We have seen it through Thatcher, and we've seen it right up to the recent Trade Union Act, that first past the post has delivered nothing for the collective organisation of workers. It has delivered nothing for workers in the workplace. And for that reason alone, we should all be backing PR. But I started where I will finish, Crispin, in saying that proportional representation needs not to be a subject of the anoraks, but needs to be a subject that is interesting to people, where people feel that they can change their lives. It could be talked about within bringing the voting age for youngsters down to 16. It should be talked about in respect of electoral reform that abolishes the House of Lords. And for all of us in this Zoom who want people to be interested in electoral reform and believe in its importance to society, I will leave you with this sexy message. If we had proportional representation, we would not have the likes that we have in Labour at the moment representing people in Parliament. The idea that those people on proportional representation would be put into communities where the vote actually matters and be able to get that vote on behalf of Labour, they simply would not be able to, because those people in those communities would say, you do not represent me, and I will look to someplace else for my vote to go. And if that isn't the Greens or a Workers' Party, it would find a place to go to. So whenever we talk about proportional representation being democratic, whenever we talk about it being essential in order to represent the voices of our communities, whenever we talk about it being essential for trade unionism, remember this, it will change the landscape in respect of the PLP within Labour, and it may well just save Labour as far as being a socialist party is concerned. Thank you, Crispin.
Thank you, Howard. You're a little bit over 5, but I'll let you off because you did bring out the sexy side of PR. Now, I'm going to bring in Norman from Kent. Now, Norman, we're moving on to people who actually don't think PR is the answer and may be against PR. So, Norman, do you want to tell us why you don't think PR is the answer at the moment?
Sure. I'm as you say, I'm Norman Thomas, and I'm the still suspended member of South Thanet Labour Party and a founding member of the new grouping Labour in Exile Network. I'm not in love with the first past the post system. I agree with Howard on that one, but I would say that proportional representation is no guarantee of a better society or a more humane society making better decisions. We only have to look as far as Israel. They've got proportional representation. But more, another example is the African country of Lesotho, who 2002, they brought in proportional representation from a first past the post system, which they inherited from Britain. They brought it in. It was a great success to begin with, gave a voice to opposition parties. 5 years later, the politicians learned to work the system and they were in turmoil again. More topically, Myanmar, the military in Myanmar, who we know have taken over, they're all in favor of proportional representation. They want it. The National League of Democracy people, the people that they're sticking in jail at the moment, are against it. Why? It's very simple, because they know that the military can use the proportional representation system to gain more power, to gain power forever, even if they if they give up on it for a while. So it's the point is, and even our own party, it's hardly a great advert for PR, is it? Old Keir Starmer was elected by a form of PR, and he's been driving a coach and 6 horses through democracy in our party ever since. So I don't really always trust that PR will give us the best result. Politicians are cunning, crafty people. The election result may perfectly reflect the will of the electorate when it's voted on. Doesn't mean they won't betray the trust of the people as soon as you give them power. You need something much deeper than a voting system to achieve that. What we want, and what I want, and I think a lot of the people here want, is a socialist society. I don't think PR is going to help us achieve that. Bringing in PR isn't going to change the way that we are demonized in the media. It isn't going to change the way that our MPs are unaccountable to the members or our bureaucracy. It's not really going to address that at all, because the politicians are going to work around it. The establishment is too powerful. They've got too much power. The problem we've got in Britain is it's a hierarchical society where there is incredible power at the top. The Jeremy Corbyn years showed that. We had a member, a leader who was backed by the vast majority of the members, a huge mass movement to supporting him, and yet he was destroyed by a political establishment that was afraid of him, absolutely afraid of him. What we need, rather than changing the voting system, although I wouldn't be averse to changing the voting system in the future, but what we really need, if we want to address the problems that we've got, is a mass political movement. We need a Labour Party that's in Parliament, but that it's backed by an extra parliamentary grouping that will actually help the socialist movement take over the country. I think we can do that next time, and I believe that there will be a next time. We'll have learned from the mistakes of now, and we will push ahead and actually create the sort of socialist society that we all desire. Thank you, Tom.
Norman. Yeah, can I just say about the chat and stuff? But can we be comradely to each other in the chat? If you don't agree with someone, just say you don't agree with them. But please don't make anything personal. Let's be comradely here. As you know, Howard did start off with a sexy speech, but that doesn't mean it has to go downhill. So let's get Gary on. Gary Griffiths, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, I'll go straight because haven't got much time. I'll go straight in if that's okay, Crispin.
Sure.
Okay. I mean, the top 1% and probably 5% do not want true democracy. They're afraid of the majority. There are many countries with one form of PR or another, yet socialist governments are thin on the ground. Why? I believe that the discussion on merits, demerits of proportional representation is a total distraction. It is irrelevant if a large proportion of the electorate is disenfranchised because they feel the politicians do not represent them. Does proportional representation itself solve this? No, it doesn't. What it does is create the illusion of having your voice heard and continues the divide and rule strategy through the need for a consensus around usually the right of politics, as far-right voices, parties force the agenda around divisive issues of race and identity politics. Who can be more nationalistic? Who wants to rally around the flag? Who wants to be hard on immigration and policing, etc.? Just look at European countries which have embraced PR: Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Slovakia, Austria, Ukraine, Bulgaria. Some of these countries are seeking to honor Nazis as so-called war heroes. There are bigger questions to answer and bigger issues to address. I believe policies and trust in the candidates is key. Jeremy Corbyn proved that in 2017. Manifestos can win elections, as clearly shown by Corbyn in 2017, nearly, but for the undermining internally and the kind of shortness of canvassing, etc., and all the other issues. I really do not believe we should be discussing the individual merits of one PR or another. It is irrelevant. If we do not have a free press, if the media is controlled and owned by an elite, moneyed, anti-democratic minority, and if we are not reaching out and engaging with the electorate. We need to address these and other issues about suffrage, about education of the electorate, about how information is provided, how it is packaged, how it is presented, about who is funding who and what, and so many more fundamental matters, not least who is pushing the proper proportional representation agenda, who is flirting with it today. I believe PR is raising its head and, of course, gathering cross-party support as a device to keep socialism at bay. If we want to ensure people engage with voting and the issues, then why do we not have compulsory voting? Alongside which, why on the ballot paper do we not have a box which says none of the above? If that is the majority, then the election must be rerun in that constituency. If a party gets only 45% of the total vote and yet 48 out of 59 seats, like the Scottish National Party did recently, is that the SNP's fault? Is it the voting fault? No, it's the way that the constituency have been drawn up, the demographics. We need to review those boundaries. We need to balance intersectionality and demographics. Fixed state funding for elections so the influence of financial lobbying is removed. Enshrined and enforced impartiality of state media. Other media would have to declare their funding, etc. These are the key issues. Proportional representation leads to compromise on the right of centre through the influence of right-wing narratives, which are divisive and support reactionary capitalism. Proportional representation is a mechanism to preserve the status quo of flawed political system which benefits the few, not the many. It is a substitute for addressing the real issues underlying voter democracy. They don't want another Corbyn moment, but if we fight and unite, they will. If only 50, 60, 70% of the electorate vote, PR does nothing. If 50, 40, 30% are not voting, there's a lot that I like about Howard, but on many issues on what he said today, I disagree. First time, Howard.
Thank you, Gary. Now we're going to Christopher Gould. Are you there, Christopher?
I am. Can't see me. Can you see me?
I can see your name in big letters, but...
Well, I'm sorry that you can't see me, but I'll speak away anyway.
Go on.
God, well, yes, very, very interested. I'm not totally against proportional representation. I don't say that the system we have now is the good system and all the other systems are bad systems. Don't make the mistake of some of the PR enthusiasts who seem to be like that. I would say that our system is an unfair system amongst other unfair systems. I mean, there isn't just one PR. There's lots of versions of PR. All of them contain problems. All of them contain imperfections, just like our present system. Now, our present system also has defects, but it has certain virtues which others don't have. For instance, when you put a program before before the electorate, that program is taken seriously. Why? Because the party will govern and will be expected to carry out its measures. It won't be like 2 or 3 parties or just come in a coalition and then all the things in the programs will be forgotten and it will just be decided in a smoke-filled room. So that's one thing. When they say, I would say it's unappealing to me for Labour to do this because it seems to be a complaint of the losers. It's like we can't win under the present system. But when people talk about, say, oh, it's only first past the post, right? Oh, it's only first past the post. But what if you've got 700 goes at coming first past the post? And like the Liberals, you can only do it 10 times. Maybe the real problem is you lack popularity, you know, that you have to gain popularity. You can't gain some kind of fix with some illusory alternative system. Like other people, there are virtues in alternatives. Right here, I mean, it depends what you want. What you'd have to say, we want something out of a changed electoral system, but it can't just be, well, Labour will do better under this or that system. Other contenders would have to approve of us. And of course, that's always going to be in the way of you know, changing the electoral system. If you get into power, you change the electoral system. You've got to think of a system whereby passively you'll be, having got into power, you'll subtract from your own party. but proverbially, people are reluctant to do this. It's got to appeal to. It can't be something simply to benefit one side. It has to benefit a number of sides. And I think this is the difficulty. People always appeal to changing the electoral system only to put themselves forward. It's only for their own advantage.
Right.
But it has to be fair all round.
Okay.
There, I'll stop.
Right, thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to Felicity. Are you there, Felicity?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Brilliant. So I'd like to talk about the disadvantages of proportional representation. Over the last few years, PR has been promoted so effectively that it has become the market leader without the need for much public debate. The Lib Dems are wedded to it. The Labour Party continues to review its policy. The Brexit Party and other far-right parties see it as leading to their representation as it has for other neo-fascist parties in Europe. Types of PR differ greatly, though the most talked of for the UK are either AV or STV, both of which have weaknesses. STV requires multi-member constituencies where a candidate would need to achieve a majority. AV isn't a proportional vote for the country, but applies a variant of STV in a single-member constituency. Neither STV or AV offer any guarantee of PR in Parliament as a whole, which is rarely mentioned. Both systems can produce unfair results at the constituency level. PR requires votes for the party slates rather than individual candidates. PR weakens the constituency representative link. Very large multi-member districts undermine the relationship between constituents and MPs. For example, the Netherlands, as an entire country, is one district, as is Israel. Under first past the post, for example, MPs serve the constituency they campaign in. Thus, PR lowers accountability for individual candidates. One only has to look at the EU as an example. Even where PR uses regional districts, they could be so large geographically that access is problematic. Compromise is not always ideal, as it can lead to weak and indecisive governments. PR may increase the representativeness of government, but it also increases its instability, as it tends to produce multi-party legislatures and coalitions. These coalitions can be fragile, as seen in Italy, where governments rarely, in some cases, last long enough to enact any manifesto promises, or as in Israel, where minor, small, ultra-religious parties have had their policy proposals enacted by threatening to pull out. Government coalitions held together by political protection rackets are notoriously weak and unstable. They tend to produce either paralysis or upheaval. PR rewards narrow agendas, which gives parties the green light to ignore the views of the mainstream. A one-issue party only needs to target a minority of voters, as they only need 10 to 20% of the vote. Small parties can also become kingmakers. Thus, it can become a small party, not the voters, that really decides who wins the election. The majority party can often be excluded from power. This is arbitrary and undemocratic. Small parties get too many concessions in coalition governments, often eliciting concessions that result in the adoption of radical policies not supported by most voters, as seen in Israel. PR paves the way for extremist parties. In Europe, far-right parties have made deep inroads, even taking power in Hungary and Poland. PR encourages extremism's rise. For example, the AfD in Germany, Salvini's party in Italy, in the Netherlands, and so on. With PR, for example, in the 2015 UK general election, UKIP would have secured 83 seats and been the third largest party, with polls predicting that 90% of voters would vote in the future. It can also leave a country ungoverned, as in the case of Belgium, who went 18 months without a functioning government. Finally, we see the rise of authoritarian dictators all over the world who have won power through PR, such as Turkey, Brazil, the Philippines, etc., where unstable, ineffective governments have allowed in extremism. And can I just say one more point? Whether we need PR or some form of PR, now is not the time to do it. Just as Brexit wasn't the time when we did the vote for Europe, it wasn't the time to do it. So now isn't the time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. That was fantastic.
Okay.
I just want to say there have been points made in the chat. There's all kinds of different systems of PR. And what we're going to move on to now is, because we had a general discussion at the beginning, is we're going to talk about individual countries and experiences in those countries, because I think that's really key, because there are so many systems. And to speak firstly on that is Mervyn. Are you there, Mervyn?
Yep, I'm here.
Can you
put the graph up as well?
Yeah, you want to speak about Germany?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So I've got the graph that you sent me, which is here. And do you want to explain what's happening here?
Yeah. Well, basically, the black line is the Conservatives. The red line is the Socialists, or Social Democrats, as they really are. And what it shows is that from 1949 to 2017, under a system of PR that they have, which is a complex one, and I don't want to go into the details of it because it is complex and it isn't typical, but it is a PR system nevertheless. You can see that if you want to gain power, then they only gain power twice in that whole period from 2017 back to 1949. So if we want a system of PR that gives us power, it's not really the real answer, in my view anyway. But really, if we look at the graph, you can see that basically the Conservatives have been maintained in power over that whole period, right to the end. Even, you know, I can't quite see on the end of the graph because there's all the video stuff in the way. But if you could get to the end of the graph, you would see that the Tories, even though they're dipping, well, the Conservatives, although they're dipping down, likewise, the Socialists are dipping down, and they are still above, way above. They're 10 points above the SPD. Now, there are lots of reasons politically why parties win and lose, but they're based on policies. I don't think they're based on the system. And that is what we've got to get over to people, is that it's policies that matter, really. And if you look along the center of this graph, you'll see CDSU, SPD, CDSU, SPD, CDSU. Now, those are the governments that were formed at that particular year. And if you look as well, there's this FDP that keeps cropping up, and that's the coalitions. So all the way through, they've been coalitions. They have not been governments of their own right. They're all coalitions. There's the green one here on the 2002 column. You'll see there's the SPD and the Greens. On the 1972 column, you've got the SPD and FDP. But along with that, everywhere else, they've been in coalition with the CDU and CSU. Now, that is the kind of governments that I think that proportional representation actually throws up. And so the beauty of it is it's down in the bottom. Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking, I mean, I just want to say, because Howard said at the beginning that this system, first past the post, is skewed for the Tories. Are you suggesting that the German proportional representation system is skewed for the right wing as well?
It basically promotes the establishment, yeah.
Right.
It's and socialists only on 2 occasions actually formed what you might call a government of their own, but they still formed it in a coalition. But they only had a majority over the Tories on 2 occasions in the whole of that period, where the Tories came out, or at least the German Conservatives came out on top. Now,
okay.
And the other point about it is really is that, you know, a voting system doesn't change people's mindsets. It's the politics that change people's mindsets. And if we want to get into power, we've got to change people's mindset, not the system of how to get into power. I'm not saying it's perfect, you know, first past the post is perfect. Not at all.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Mervyn. Now Giorgio Finella in Hove. Are you there?
Hi there. Yes, I am.
Now you have experience of or knowledge of the Italian PR system. How has it played out there?
Well, I suppose, Crispin, I'd have to say that I was in Italy in the 90s when Berlusconi was about to come to power, and the communist clubs were running. They were running events to raise funds where you could pay 33p to save the socialists to put up against Berlusconi. But I suppose what I'd like to say is in Italy in the 90s, Moana Pozzi, who was a famous porn star, got 5,000 people to sign up to her political party, the Partito dell'Amore, and she became a proper political party in Italy with as little as 5,000 votes. The good thing in Italy is that you get money for state funding for political parties. But if you look at Italy, we have a changing government almost daily in some years. When we've put technocrat governments in of Mario Monti, both sides couldn't agree, so we went for a technocrat government. Then they disagreed with the technocrat government. And it's all about alliances that formed between the right and the left. And in certain circumstances, parties that would never in anybody's minds come together to set up governments that shortly after then decide to fall apart. So I suppose it's be careful what you wish for, because as some others have said, the likes of the BNP would be in power now if it were for PR. The referendum party would have got seats in government, seats in the Houses of Parliament if it was down to PR. And I suppose it's, as much as we'd like the left to get an advantage, we also have to remember where the right are coming from. And I suppose, as many others that are more learned than myself have said, PR also benefits the far right. And I suppose, would we want that more than the far left? And I suppose that's my question through all of it, as in PR is good, as I think, but be careful what you wish for.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for coming on. Good to see you. Nice background. Brighton looks much better than it used to. Now we're moving on to Dave Kellaway, who is in favour of PR. So everyone we've heard, apart from Howard, has been not so keen on PR. Dave, you have experience in France and Italy of PR, and
yes, I've lived in France, and I've been in Italy for the last 3 months. In fact, I know Italy. I know the Spanish state and Portugal quite well. And if you ask anybody on the left in these countries, from the radical left to the sort of more moderate left, nobody would argue for bringing in first past the post. Why? Because the proportional systems, particularly in Spanish state, in Portugal and in Italy, allows left parties, class struggle parties, to be represented. For example, in the 90s, the comrade before was talking about the 90s in Italy, there might have been the Napoleon party, okay, but Rifondazione, which is a left-wing party, a split from the Communist Party at the time, was able to operate and get 8%, 9%, 10% of the vote. And that made a difference to the struggles going on at the time. Now, of course, PR on its own doesn't solve the political problems of building a left. Because as we've seen in Italy now, there is no left represented in Parliament at all. Rifondazione has disappeared. So I agree with the comrades. PR in itself is not a magic bullet, but it is the fairest of all the bourgeois democratic systems we have. And as a socialist, I'm always in favour of the most democratic systems possible. Now, these arguments about the fascists being allowed in. Now, already, again, talk to left-wing people in Spanish state, Portugal, Italy, France. They don't argue against the right of hard right parties to be represented. They don't mobilise to stop them. They don't organise campaigns to say Le Pen or Salvini shouldn't be in power, shouldn't be in government. It's ridiculous to argue. You can't argue that anymore. They represent a certain part of the popular vote. You have to win votes. You have to win against those people in social mobilisations and election campaigns to win people from those people. You can't do it just by hiding behind some sort of first past the post system. In any case, people talk about coalitions, and we have to separate out the question of PR from coalitions. I'm not in favour of coalitions with Lib Dems, for example, and we shouldn't argue for PR as a moderate position. That's not what I'm arguing. But the point is, the Labour Party left already in a coalition with the Labour Party centre and right wing. Corbynism might have taken a different turn at the end if we'd had a PR system in this country. But it's very, very difficult in this country to start a left-wing alternative. Very difficult because of the system. And that therefore inhibits the development of a Labour or a socialist left in this country, in my opinion. That's another reason why I'm in favour of PR. But it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve things. But just take the example of Portugal at the moment. The left bloc in Portugal is an independent party, has about 8% of the vote, and is able to support the progressive measures of a left social democratic government without taking ministers. That means you have a situation where, to some degree, the Portuguese workers have been defended to some extent from the worst aspects of austerity. Similarly, in Spain, the Spanish state, Podemos has been able to get 12% of the vote in the Spanish state and is now in the government. I don't agree with them being in government, but at least it shows you that a left-wing group starting just 6 or 7 years ago of socialists can develop. PR allows you to do that. The first past the post system makes that very, very difficult.
Right. Okay. Look, Dave. I know you've written an article now. I hope you put it in the chat.
Yeah.
And
anti-capitalist system website.
You've got lots more to say. I know 3 minutes is tough.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to bring in Barbara, who has experience of New Zealand's system of PR. Are you there, Barbara?
Yes, I've just unmuted myself. Yes, the New Zealand has a PR system that's called MMP, Mixed Member Proportional. What that means is that 50% of the MPs in Parliament are voted, they get there as a result of standing in an electorate. The other 50% are voted into Parliament as a result of a list that parties put together. They have their own hierarchy. Of course, number one would be the leader of the party, number two, the treasurer, and so on. But what that does mean, and this has been referred to before by another participant, it means that the party's manifesto is extremely important, because this is how people will vote for the party. And what the system has been in New Zealand, in effect in New Zealand, for 25 years. And New Zealand electorate has become very, very comfortable and very knowledgeable about the system works. Of course, it is all to do with arithmetic. It's different arithmetic from first past the post. The one thing you don't do is you don't split your vote. You decide which party you wish to be in power, and you give them both of your votes. You give them the electorate vote and you give them the party vote. You don't decide, I'm going to give Labour my party vote and I'm going to vote for this Green MP as my electorate MP. Because what happens is that list MPs enter Parliament on the percentage of party vote that they get. And so, yes, it does produce, generally speaking, coalitions, but over the last two elections, the last election rather in New Zealand, it has produced, strangely enough, not even a coalition vote, but a majority vote for a Labour government that it has put up a largely socialist manifesto. Now, the advantages of the PR system as it operates in New Zealand is that it has given a much, much more representative parliament than in the first past the post system. 48% of New Zealand MPs are women, 48% are women. 21% of MPs are Maori MPs, who are the Indigenous people of New Zealand. In the 70s, Maori had 2 MPs in Parliament. Now they've got about 15 or 16 MPs. More Pacific Island MPs are there, more Asian MPs, Chinese MPs. In this last election, New Zealanders even voted their first African refugee MP, a man from Eritrea. So it is much, much more representative. The other thing, or 2 other things, those people who represent communities, ethnic communities, are much closer to the constituents that they stand for. And so you get very, very, well, as a result of that, you get many fewer career politicians. It is a much more, demographically speaking, a much more representative parliament. Okay. Yes, there are drawbacks. There are drawbacks. You have to, at the moment, 5%, a party has to get 5% in order to stand MPs in an election. And in a way that I think that percentage needs to be higher. At the moment, that 5% does keep out far-right parties, nutters, conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, and so on. But on the other hand, it has allowed the rump of a very right-wing Labour Party from the 1980s to still have quite a representation in former parliaments, in coalition with a Tory-like party. But unlike the person who was talking about the German situation, it hasn't always favoured Tories. There have been periods under MMP when Labour has held power in the Parliament. And as I said, I mean, the most wonderful thing about the latest election is that Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party doesn't need coalition partners. They've actually got 56% of the vote under MMP.
Okay, so, sorry, Barbara. I'm just thinking. I've got about 5.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing? I think here it would be very difficult to get PR launched because the media here, which are part of the establishment, of course, would be very, very against PR in any kind of form.
All right. So, all right. Well, that's another show. Malcolm, and you were actually you were specialising in Italy as well. We've had Italy already, but do you want to speak about Italy?
Yes, well, other people have talked about Italy, but I'm really going to talk about the current PR system in Italy, which I don't think people have really talked about. The current system was passed into law in 2017, and it means that about 37% of the members of both houses are elected by first past the post, and 61% are elected by a closed list PR system. There's a 3% threshold. 2% are elected by Italian residents overseas. There are some flaws in this system, which I think the Italians are already aware of and want to try to overcome. For example, you only have one vote. So you're forced to vote for the list which is linked with your chosen first past the post candidate. You can't kick out a constituency MP from a party you like without hurting them nationally. So that's different from the Scottish system, for example. Also, unlike in the Scottish Parliament, the list seats don't compensate for the disproportionality of the first past the post vote. Because only 37% of the representatives are elected by first past the post, the constituencies are extremely large, which reduces the connection between the representative and the voter. And lastly, unlike with a single transferable vote system, you can't express a preference for which candidates within each list should be elected, or you can't rank them preferentially. So those are some of the disadvantages in the present system. The Lega extreme right-wing party, the one led by Matteo Salvini, wants to move to a first-past-the-post system. It's currently leading the polls on 30 to 33% of the vote. And an FPTP system would suit Lega because it would almost certainly give them an overall majority with only 1/3 of the vote. And that shows the dangers of a first-past-the-post system. The other parties, naturally, have opposed this move, and the Five Star Movement, for example, wants to move to an almost perfect PR system. Most commentators accept that the problems of fragmentation and unstable government, which have plagued Italian politics, are not a result of the electoral system, but rather of regional inequalities, clientelism, and corruption. If Italy did switch to a first-past-the-post system, or a more majoritarian way of electing its representatives, it wouldn't solve these problems. It would restrict democracy, reduce voter choice, and leave many citizens unrepresented. Reform of the current system, especially the proportional representation element, is the best option for Italy, and I think for us too.
All right. Well, thank you for keeping to the 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And Simon Thompson, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Crispin.
Hi. Right. So 3 minutes. I'm going to be strict now because Clive Lewis is here and he's got longer. So what would you like to say about Germany? Because you've heard the opposite of it being good. People have been saying it. We've heard from Mervyn that it's actually skewed against the left. What would you say to that?
Well, I actually want to give perspective from the UK first, because I was actually the parliamentary candidate in Dartford in 2015, and I campaigned hard and we run the local campaign, but we lost big time. And the reason why? Because it's a safe Tory seat normally, except when Labour has a big majority. And that's reflective of a lot of the UK constituencies. We have very few constituencies in the UK that actually are truly democratic, where every vote counts, and lots of them are safe seats. Lots of them therefore create very lazy politicians on all sides of the political spectrum. Your vote is wasted. It's very few votes actually count towards the party, even though you vote for them, the party that actually wins power in that seat. It is undemocratic, and as Howard said, actually, I'm another one who thinks that voting systems can actually be sexy. And actually, as a former BBC journalist, I made them sexy. I actually made a series of films about electoral systems for a younger audience to explain different electoral systems. We even used an Australian water polo team to explain the alternative member system, the alternative vote system in Australia. They were voting for their swimwear. So yes, voting systems can be sexy. And although it's not necessarily the most important issue for people, it does reflect what's a wider problem with a lack of democracy in the UK. Our system is supposed to be the mother of parliaments. It is archaic and outdated. So somebody talked about extremist parties. To be honest, we saw the rise of UKIP in the last 10, 15 years in Parliament, in our democratic system. And if that had been dealt with earlier by addressing the issues that were causing the rise of UKIP, then perhaps we wouldn't have seen Brexit happen in the first place. And so ultimately what happened in the UK, the UKIP party didn't win power, no, because under first past the post, instead, as some people have mentioned already, the government went more extremist. So it is, for me, it's a no-brainer. And I've been a committed member of a committee supporter of PR or electoral reform for a long, long time. You mentioned Germany. Germany has the additional member system, and that was designed very much to be a two-way system, to have the constituency MPs first, but also to have a top-up system. So you have the list system, regional lists, to allow a better proportional reflection of the votes cast in Parliament. And it was designed very much to make sure that the German democratic system did stay democratic after the war. It It was worked out by the Allies to make sure that Germany became a democratic country and didn't go through the experiences of 30s and 40s again. And it's not, lots of people talked about two systems tonight, STV, alternative vote, which others have said is not, of course, proportional. And it's not beyond the realm of possibilities for psephologists, for electoral experts, for political parties to have a convention and come up with a system that works for Britain. It doesn't have to be a typical existing system at the moment. We can still have the element of constituency representation and perhaps through wider constituencies, but people seem to like that local MP link, and there's no reason at all why we can't have a system that is unique to the UK. So I would say, as I think Barbara spoke very eloquently about the New Zealand system, there's a lot that has happened in New Zealand that has changed as a result of the system, better for democracy. And I think electoral reform is one part of a democratic argument we have to have, a democratic debate about renewing our democracy in the UK. And Keir Starmer, finally, during the hustings debates, he committed to having a convention on electoral reform as leader, and we should hold him to that.
Oh, well, thank you, Simon. And people want to see those videos, by the way, of the Australian swimmers. So please put them through to us. Nina in Labour International in Spain. So you can talk about the Spanish system, Nina.
Well, not with the same kind of expertise as lots of people have. I've lived in the same small town for nearly 20 years now, and obviously in Spain we have the list system, voting for parties. What it has given me is a total belief in coalitions. I think the government, local government and national government works so much better when there are coalitions. And I've stood as a candidate for PSOE, the Spanish Socialist Party, here in my town, only on the understanding that I wouldn't get elected, because I certainly didn't want to be, as I didn't when I was a candidate for Labour in Cardiff. But the town hall works so much better when it's a coalition. For the last 6 years, we've had a socialist majority, and things have not gone as well at all. I think the pressure from other parties, particularly from the left parties, makes such a difference to the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party in Spain, PSOE, with Pedro Sanchez, really has been moved so far to the left by having to be in a coalition with Podemos. And I really, if I believe one thing from my experience of politics, it's that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I do believe in the value of having different opinions and having to make concessions to different people. Yeah, I just do. I think you know, there are all sorts of different PR systems. The one in Spain, you know, it's just the list system. You could only have one vote. You can only vote for one party, so you can't pick a candidate from different ones. But I say, at the moment in Spain and Portugal, I'm just so glad to live here during the pandemic, because I think the kind of communist socialist coalitions that we have in both those countries have really made such a difference to living here. So,
thank you, Nina. That's keeping it short. Duncan, you've got experience from Northern Ireland, is that right?
Yes, yeah. I ran under the STV system in 1998 to be elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly following the Good Friday Agreement. So yeah, I have experience with STV. I mean, STV actually has quite a long history in Britain. It comes from Thomas Hare, the British intellectual, came up with it in the 1850s, and it was actually promoted as an idea for PR throughout the electoral reform arguments that went on through the 19th century and into the 20th century. So it's had quite strong support within the UK. It was imposed on Ireland in 1920 as part of the agreement in let's say in 1920 in relation to the setting up of the Irish Free State, and it was adopted then as the electoral system for the Irish Free State in 1920. It was also then imposed by the Westminster government on the Northern Ireland Parliament, Stormont Parliament in 1922, which ran from 22 to 1972. But the Stormont Parliament, because it was dominated by unionists who did not want actually increased nationalist representation in Stormont, changed back to the first past the post system for the Stormont Parliament from 22 through to 1950 or 1972. So, you know, it shows that FPTP can be used in that way to actually reduce representation. The key question that people are really not, I think, grappling with to some extent here is the issue is, what is it you actually want from an electoral system? Do you want a system that leads to the best possible representation, the most proportionate representation of the wider community and all of the aspects of parts of views, opinions and diversity of that community? Or do you want a system that basically gives a semblance of democratic legitimacy to a smaller group who are not necessarily a majority, but who will then exercise so-called democratic power over the rest of the nation? Now, that's the question you ask yourself. Now, if you want that, fair enough. I mean, Schumpeter argued that this is essentially what elections are about, is choosing who you want to run the country. It's not necessarily about having the most representative group. On the other hand, if we want a parliament or a Northern Ireland Assembly that's representative, then you need to actually move towards a PR system, because only that can be truly representative. Now, there was a point made earlier as well about the fact that there's not a constituency link in PR. Well, that's not true, because I was elected as an MLA. I was one of 6 MLAs in the constituency of South Antrim. I was known to my constituents. I worked with my constituents. They knew how to contact me. I did lots of constituency work. I held regular surgeries. I held a surgery every week in my constituency office. So yeah, you do have a direct link. And the idea that MPs in Westminster have a very strong direct link to their constituency is a bit of a misnomer, seen as about 70% of the electorate can't name their MP. So just how strong is that link when most people wouldn't know their MP if they bumped into them in the street? And that's partly a problem of MPs who are sitting in constituencies where you basically weigh that particular party vote, and they don't have to compete for the support of the electorate because they know they're going to get it because of the rosette that they happen to go out with on election day. And that applies both to members of the PLP and Tory members as well, both of whom are full of useless seat warmers as far as I can see. So, you know, I think the arguments that have been put forward about PR have been in some ways a bit weak, as well as conflating problems with broader electoral systems with maybe the choices that people are making in elections is not necessarily the fault of the electoral system itself. If people are going to vote for UKIP, the problem there is the fact that a lot of people are being suckered by the arguments that UKIP or whatever fascist organisation are putting forward. That's our problem. And what happens instead in a first past the post system is, rather than them being represented in a particular distinct political party, they get absorbed into one of the 2 larger parties instead, and you end up with effectively UKIP having by osmosis infiltrated itself into the Conservative Party and driven it far over to the right. Okay. Now, you know, lastly, just a quick point on PR. Yeah, people are saying it doesn't deliver a socialist government. Well, first past the post has not delivered a socialist government. First past the post in this country doesn't even deliver a government that's representative of the majority of people. 14 out of the last 15 elections, the government that's in power, quite often with quite substantial majorities, has not won a majority. Most, over 2/3 of MPs do not get elected by a majority in their constituency. And as far as it being a broad representation, what actually happens is that fewer than 90 key marginal seats decide which party is going to be in government. So a very small part of the electorate, less than 1 million, in fact, fewer than 1 million, basically choose based on them happening to be lucky enough to live in a marginal seat. I live in a marginal seat, so I get to have an outsized vote. But one of my colleagues who lives over in Romsey or something can do stuff all, because it doesn't matter what they vote in terms of the Labour vote, the Tories are going to win that seat by a handy majority. And the same goes in different places. So rather than, a broad election,
I've got to move on.
It's a small group.
I've got to move on. You nearly matched Howard for minutes there. Right now, Dave Levy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Just give me a second. I want to get my notes.
I hope they're not long notes.
They're not long notes, no. I understand that, and we're running out of time, so let's start. I'd like to thank Howard for his start, because it encourages us to keep our eyes high, to look at the big principled issues of how we choose governments and the nature of parliaments. We need to understand the problems with first past the post are strong governments. They are opaque coalitions. The coalition is made before the election, and it's made behind closed doors. and it's made without a mandate. If you have a PR system, the coalitions are made in the light and the compromises are clear to the people that have made the vote and sent representatives there. Underrepresented minorities means that losers' consent is harder to obtain. It's a system that's easy to game in a system that encourages gaming. I like James McCash's comment that he described FTP as an illusory shortcut and proved that it isn't even that. We don't talk enough to people, we ignore most of our supporters, and we are derailed when we do achieve governments because we don't have people that hold us to account. People have spoken about the constituency link. It can be maintained, and others would question how real it is on the first past the post. And how many MPs have actually never actually visited their constituency other than during an election. Some would argue that PR will allow unacceptable views to enter our parliament, and I would say with the Brexit party's entryism into the Tory party, they already have. People have spoken about New Zealand, so I shan't repeat that. I just want to say one or two things about Germany, and that is that their lists are run by regions, and the CDU are the major partners in governments with the SPD because people vote for them. It's not because of the system. I want to briefly talk about Israel because you wanted me to. I've never lived in either Germany or I never lived as a voter either in Germany or Israel or New Zealand. But it is clearly not a beacon for PR on questions whether the outcomes of the elections are the problem or whether the nature of the politics and the way people vote. But the Knesset is very small, which makes it very difficult for it to accurately represent a large range of views. It also has a very low entry threshold that many PR systems have a threshold which the parties need to win a vote. In order to get in. Israel's is very low, but it's true that small parties are disproportionately powerful and that also significant minorities are underrepresented. But that doesn't mean that PR itself is a global failure. And I want to finish by saying that in London, of course, we have a mayor elected by supplementary vote, and we have an assembly elected by additional member system, whereby people vote in the constituency and vote for a party. And Labour has had a majority in that. It has been the largest party in the assembly since it was established. And but we shouldn't be deciding this on the basis of what our interests are. This should be about democracy, and we should consider the big issues of selection of government, selection of representation, the power of parliaments to represent people and to hold governments to account. And this will all be more effective under a PR system.
Oh, thank you, Dave. That was very, very well timed and everything. I just want to say, before I bring Clive Lewis on, thank you, Clive, by the way, for waiting this long. I came into this pretty much opposed to PR, and I think what I've heard has made me think that PR has, if we can find the right system for it, it could actually, along with other changes to the way we do politics, could make a big difference. That's my way of sweetening the intro to Clive. Are you there, Clive?
I am. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I came in. I was at Wansbeck CLP doing a talk with them about this very issue. So there's a lot of demand amongst members at the moment about this issue. People, I think, are coming with open minds, which is something I haven't seen before. You know, so they're coming with open minds and they're listening to the arguments. And you know, in a democratic socialist party or an allegedly democratic socialist party, that's good, because and I think the standard of the debate tonight, both for and against, has been the best I've heard, you know, anywhere. So it's been absolutely brilliant listening to that. I missed Howard at the beginning. That's probably why I thought it was so good, Howard? But
well, Howard
where is he? Is he still here? I hope he is. I'm going to get in trouble if I think I'm talking behind his back. But no, I heard Howard was really good. I heard he was really funny. Yeah, I mean, I missed that bit, but I caught the last kind of from the midpoint onwards, and it was a really fantastic kind of level of debate. And you know what? I kind of, you know, one of the things I think we have to ask ourselves is I genuinely feel that PR isn't a silver bullet. You know, it is not, and I'm going to come back on to that in a minute. It isn't. Anyone that thinks it is, isn't a silver bullet. Looking at other countries as well, has limitations. You know, looking at Israel, for example, I mean, Israel is a country which has a unique set of circumstances. Looking at Germany, it's a country whose constitution we helped write post-war for obvious reasons, to ensure that there were democratic principles enshrined inside their constitution, you know, and we did that there, but we didn't do it here. So you can look at different countries, and ultimately we have to look at what we think we can make work in this country. And we have a very specific set of, political attitudes and institutions which will dictate how that unfolds. So how it would unfold here doesn't necessarily mean how it would unfold in another country. So I think there are limitations looking at other countries. In terms of the system that we want, I try to avoid that, not because it's complex, which it is, and democracy and working out how to govern ourselves is a complex thing, and rightly so, because we are complex individuals and we live in a complex society in a complex world. And it's right that our democratic systems are complex. That's just one of the realities that we face. But the reason it's really important to try to kind of get to the bottom of this is because it basically works out how we engage with our democratic system. And I think ultimately, if you look at a voting system, the ballot box isn't the end of the political process. It's not even the start. We should be talking about democracy in our workplaces. We live in a society, in an economy. When you walk over the line into work, you walk into a dictatorship of capital. You get told how long you can go to the toilet for, how long your break is. You don't get any say in most workplaces, unless maybe you work in John Lewis or something like that in a cooperative, but you don't get no say. So, democracy doesn't just start at the ballot box. That's the beginning of it, if you want. It should be permeate through our society. So I don't want people to think that people like me came into politics to change the voting system. I don't. But I do think that the basis of our democracy should be how, what kind of democracy do we want to live in? And then identifying the systems and structures that'll create the kind of democracy that we want to live in. Now, for me, that's a society where there's a democracy in the workplace, as I said, and as much as in politics, and where communities have power and resource to make decisions about the things that affect them. There are many ways to configure an electoral system and elections to achieve that. And the other thing I wanted to say was, when we're talking about the different types of PR, it's not for us to tell the country what type of PR they're going to have. And I think we have to get out of that mindset. If you have a genuine democracy, you look at what's happened in Extinction Rebellion, for example, they understand the crisis of democracy. Perhaps we can touch on that, the crisis of democracy. They understand that something is broken within our political system. Now, some people say, well, that's what capitalism is. Capitalism is anti-democratic. Well, the reality that we live in is that we live in a capitalist system, and we are democratic socialists, and we are parliamentary socialists, and we're trying to change that. So that's the basis of where we start. But ultimately, it's not for us to tell people what kind of system of PR they want. And the way I look at the different options of PR, it's a sliding scale. First past the post is a form of proportional representation, a really shitty one, but it is. But it's on this scale. And with first past the post, you get a fantastic constituency link with you and your MP. That's the great thing. But at the other end of the spectrum, say on STV, on a kind of sliding scale, you get more proportionality, so that more people, their vote actually matters, their vote actually counts. Under first past the post, has already been mentioned, there are around about 1 million people at any time at one election whose vote matters. So if you live outside of one of those swing seats, you're in a safe seat. Your vote basically is nullified, it's cancelled. Now, we wonder why there are levels of apathy in our voting system, why there are levels of apathy within our general elections. I would argue that that's probably a good contender for that. You look at the ballot for Brexit, we saw people here in Norwich that hadn't come out to vote for 20 years, turning up on our polls, basically saying, because they thought that vote, whatever I think of that vote actually meant something. So empowering people, I think, is part, not all, but part of the story of ensuring that apathy, people take an interest in what's going on around them, take an interest in their politics. So I think so that's that thing. The other thing about us not deciding is, look, I believe a constitutional convention should be something that we as a party should be getting behind. And there is a friction between representative democracy and direct democracy. And I think one of the things about representative democracy is that you do develop a political class. I'm part of that class. The PLP is part of that political class. And we develop our own vested interests. Now, I've had to think long and hard about PR and what it would mean for me and my seat and my £85,000 a year and my role inside the Labour Party as a member of the PLP. I had to think about that because it will have implications. If you're going to campaign for something, try and make something happen, you want to think how it's going to affect you. And there will be other members of the PLP, some of whom are supportive of this and others who aren't, because what this will do, in effect, to the political class as it's currently configured, is it will basically shake up. Now, most of the MPs who are left inside the PLP now, this is pretty much the rump of, well, historically, the rump of where the Labour Party, the lowest level to where the Labour Party has gone. We're in safe seats. PR will make our seats unsafe. PR will mean that we will have to be more responsive, not just as MPs, but as a party, whichever party we're in, to the demands of the electorate. Is that a bad thing in a democracy? Is that a bad thing? Do you think at the moment Labour MPs, Tory MPs are necessarily representative of the views, the diversity of views of the constituents they represent? I don't think so. And I think ultimately having a more proportional system where we get to have more of a say and more of an influence in those decisions, ending so-called safe seats, I think that's good for democracy. Yes, there will be downsides to that, but I think that's a premium for me in a democratic system. So, look, let's talk about the Labour Party very quickly here. I'm coming at this as a Democrat, and I think that was a point that was made before. We can come at this in what's in the best interest for socialism, what's in the best interest for the Labour Party, and those are valid. These are the very highly valid questions. But there's also what's in the best interest of democracy, and that's where I start at this from. That's where I begin. That's where I think a lot of people come to this. But there is a genuine question about how does this work for the Labour Party? Well, let's have a look at that. Under first past the post, we know that Labour has won in the last century, so between 1918 and 2018, out of 28 elections, we have won 8. Okay? So first past the post has not ushered in an era of socialism in this country. And I think we need to understand that first past the post operates in the interest of the Tory party. And that's why you will get a maelstrom of media, commentariat and others berating the Labour Party if it got behind an issue of a more proportional voting system. So we know that the Brexit Party, if you wanted to be elected as a Brexit Party, it would have taken on average around about 600,000 votes per MP. The Green Party, to elect one MP, it took 800,000 votes. For the Liberal Democrats, 300,000 per MP. For the Labour Party, 50,000 per MP. For the Tories, 38,000 votes per MP. I think they have got it licked. They are the ones that are benefiting from the system. So if we do look at it from a solely Labour perspective, then this isn't a system that is working for us. Now, I said I come at it from a democratic angle, but there's also the angle, which is that the vast majority of political parties and political expression in this country doesn't get that expression because it's dominated by the Conservatives. Now, there are reasons for that. I'll very quickly explain the reason for that. Most of the kind of working class votes that have developed over the last century developed in towns and cities where there was a kind of growing industrialized base. And that's where the Labour Party operated. And that's where our votes have built up inside those cities. And around the Tories, their vote is far more dispersed across the country, and they benefit from that. So ultimately, there are some choices for us as a party, as a movement. This is likely to come up at the next conference for debate. If you are in a CLP and you haven't yet passed policy to try to get this debated at conference, let's have the debate. As a Democratic Socialist Party, let's get the debate and let's have it out like we have tonight, but as a movement, and then decide where we want to go. But I would argue, and this is what I will finish on, there is a crisis of democracy. And what do I mean by a crisis of democracy? Clearly, any functioning democracy does not vote for a climate and ecological catastrophe, which is what we're doing. We're kind of voting, and we know it's happening, we know it's coming towards us, and yet the system keeps on moving us towards that cliff edge. Rising inequality, the rise of surveillance capitalism, big data, big tech companies, billionaires, rising authoritarianism. You've got a political party now, the Tory party, who won with 48% of the vote, with an 80-seat majority, now reviewing judicial review, all the checks and balances, the Human Rights Act. They're about to bring in a photo suppression bill. The list goes on. There is clearly a problem with our democracy, and we have to get real to that. There will never be a great time to discuss this issue, but our democracy is important. And if we want to be a democratic socialist party, let's have that debate, let's have the arguments. I think we can win it, because I think the arguments for it are overwhelming. And I'm really glad you've had this debate tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Clive. Look, before you go, have you got to go off somewhere else? Have you got another CLP?
I've only got my dinner on. That's it. I'm just starving, but I can stay for a bit. Yes, fine. Yeah.
Yeah, because Patrick's on, and it might be good if you could say hello to Patrick. But we've got a poll here that we did of 1,168 Labour supporters in the last 3 days.
Wow.
85% voted for PR being in the next Labour manifesto. So I've seen similar polls on. I would say that it's got a very strong case from that. And I'd like to bring in Caroline, who's working on Labour for a New Democracy. Are you there, Caroline?
Oh, I am indeed. Thank you very much. So I am working for Labour for a New Democracy. It has been mentioned a few times about motions going to conference. We have an awful lot going. We've got up to 188, I believe. There's a few things tonight that have been mentioned. There's been a couple of people mentioned Israel, and I just want to point out that thresholds are really, really low in countries like Israel and Italy. And so, I mean, we talk in Labour for a New Democracy, we're not wedded to any one particular system. We think that, there needs to be, Labour needs to convene an open and wide-reaching process in order to decide what is the best system. But we do have some really strong principles about what kind of system we would support. And they do need to do things like reach that minimum threshold that keeps out problematic parties, that stops situations like Israel occurring. There's been a lot of talk tonight about various systems in various countries, and I think when it comes to PR, the point where I would always start is that look at the policy, follow policy, and look at the countries that have got decent policy. And when you look at decent socialist policy, you don't find that under first past the post. And there's a reason you don't find that under first past the post. And that is because there is a substantive right-wing bias to it. In 19 out of 20 of the last general elections, the majority of the population have voted to the left of the Conservative Party. 2/3 of that time, by the end of this parliament, 2/3 of that time, we will have had a Conservative majority government. And what that does is it shifts policy. It's continuously shifting policy further and further to the right. Well, we have a situation where Priti Patel is quite happy with refugees drowning in the sea. It's not acceptable. And we have this situation where, we can say, well, we need first past the post for a socialist government. Actually, we're in a situation where we've forgotten, policy is so skewed that we've forgotten in some ways what, a normal socialist government is. When you're talking about things that Labour are often accused of having radical policy in our press, actually things like nationalising railways, nationalising utilities, that's not terribly radical when you look at most countries that use proportional representation. And I think that's really important to remember. And my final point, because I know we're running late, is that we talk about first past the post as though it is normal democracy. It is not normal democracy. In terms of OECD nations, it's us, it's the USA, and it's Canada. And you look at the kind of governments we produce under first past the post. And in terms of Europe, the only two countries that use first past the post are us and Belarus, and that's not where we need to be when we want socialist policy.
Okay, and what do you need people to do you've got a campaign to get this discussed at conference? Is that what?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're part of that campaign, are you?
Check out Labour for a New Democracy, sign up to the campaign, put a motion to your CLP. We've got motions going up from Momentum branches as well, which is, it's great. It's really great. It's being talked about in a lot of places. If you're a union member, talk to your union branch, but sign up to the campaign. Check out our website, Labour for a New Democracy.